Hey, calling Chris Anderson. Well, I don't know if you're in Windsor, but
I wish I were.
Your soul is in Windsor.
There we go. Yes.
Chris Anderson in Windsor.
Yes. Where are you? You're in Chicago now? You're going over.
I think I am in Chicago now.
Oh, okay.
This is an encore episode, so we don't know where we are exactly. But welcome everybody to this encore episode of History Happy Hour. And thanks to Stephen Ambrose Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. So, Chris, I'm trying to figure out where you are. So last week, you were in Hawaii.
Yeah.
So we're a week out of Hawaii.
I believe that I'm either on Guam or and about to leave for Peleliu, or I'm on Peleliu.
Wow.
Can't you tell? It's nice and cold.
You've sweated up your outfit so much that I can't really tell. Well, listen, you're kind of part here, part in the Pacific. But I would just say that I want to mention to you that whether you're watching live or watching on replay or listening on the HHH
podcast.
Oh, very nice. We're glad you're here today. And we'll be talking about Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of your favorites.
As well we should be.
And D-Day, which it's not an anniversary or anything, but we're doing it a little early. Let us know what you're drinking. We should thank everybody, Chris, who supports us via Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons.
I love seeing all those full columns.
I know but don't think that there isn't room for more. Test us, I say. We will find room for more, and you can do that by going to patreon.com/historyhappyhour. And I'm sure we have many people joining us, and hopefully they are drinking good American or
Scottish,
British
gin,
or
Scottish
Scottish
Scotch or English gin. That would be
or Spanish or
just
something. I hope they're drinking something
to make
good.
The pain of History Happy Hour go away.
To blur it up a little bit. All right, man, give us a cue. Let's get this thing going. Bar is open, Chris. What do we have on tap today?
Yeah, well, I'm very excited about this book. We are joined by Michel Paradis, who is a leading human rights lawyer and historian and national security law scholar, and most recently the author of his acclaimed The Last Mission to Tokyo. And we're here this week to talk about one of my heroes, Dwight David Eisenhower, and his new book, The Light of Battle, which talks about those few months leading up to D-Day, which I would argue is probably one of the most important periods of time in the 20th century. So very excited about that.
Michel Paradis, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me on. Cheers.
Look at that. I like how he starts the show.
What cocktail did you bring?
It's both Dwight Eisenhower and generally historian relevant. So it's a glass, just a straight highball. With ice and Weller's Antique 107. I'm not this. And that's relevant for Eisenhower, whose favorite tipple of choice was a nice highball of whiskey. He didn't tell the people back in Kansas that, and made sure reporters didn't report that when they were doing profiles of him, but it was nevertheless his favorite go-to in the evenings.
And if there's any ever man who needed a drink at the end of the day, it would have been nice.
Yeah, if there's any man who needed a drink, it was Dwight Eisenhower. But this was also Robert Caro's favorite whiskey to end the day with, was particular Weller's 107. And I think anyone writing a biography in the past 50 years is essentially writing footnotes to Robert Caro's The Power Broker. I certainly feel that shadow looming coldly over me at all times when I was working on this book. So this is a combined ode to the subject of the book and one of the sort of great anxiety of influences for the book as well.
Okay.
All right, Chris, get us going here.
All right, so I wrote this down because I wanted to read it. So look at that.
Wave your arms.
I'm waving. There we go. So, sorry, guys. So, in the book, I wrote this quote down. It says, for his own office, Eisenhower opted for a standard issue field tent, a canvas room of no more than 100 square feet with 4-foot walls on its sides. Its just to the point ornamentation was limited to a carpet and a map of Normandy. Eisenhower's desk, also standard issue, was positioned to give him the full benefit of the 8-foot peak between the tent poles. This left visitors with the awkward choice of standing right in front of the desk as if in a spotlight or hunching under the sharply shaping canvas ceiling of the side, at least until Eisenhower extended the offer to sit down in one of 3 standard issue chairs that completed the tent's just to the point furnishings. And when I read that, it just struck me because you'd already gone into Ramsey's headquarters is in a Georgian estate, and Montgomery's house is in a manor, and Churchill has a private train. What does that say to you about Eisenhower?
Oh, it would say so much. It's almost a key into so much of his personality. For one thing, is he understood he was at war and always did everything he could to remind himself of that. When you're staying in these beautiful manor houses or staying in these beautiful villas in Capri or Algiers, it's very easy to remember, if you're the brass, that the war you're fighting is. It's very easy to forget, I should say, that the war you're fighting is real, that it means people in the mud, that it means people starving, that it means people dying and being mutilated where they stand. And he, at almost every turn, but especially in the lead up to D-Day, when he's in Portsmouth, it's beautiful. The weather's never been more beautiful at that point. He was very adamant that he set up a camp, a very simple camp out in the woods, and that his tent feel like he was in a forward deployment, that he didn't feel like he was in some palatial manner, so that he could at least understand and always remember that he was at war. So that was a big part of it. The small size and simple furnishing, I think, is also a reflection of his, overarching belief that leadership is not about you. It's not about your aggrandizement. It's very much about the mission you're trying to accomplish. And that if you and those around you understand that that's what you care about, you could lead them to hell and they'll follow you. But if people think that you're to sort of feather your own nest, to become a marble statue yourself, that very quickly the people you really want, the competent people, are going to sour on you, and you're only going to be surrounded with toadies and yes men who are there to try and ride your coattails. And one last piece of it, which is less romantic, but I think also shows Eisenhower's political canny, is that it's also small. And by being small, people who come in feel the pressure, right? And he is able to sort of be the one to grant them the chair to sit down, right? There's a certain almost power move to the geometry of that office that ensured that the people who came into that office also knew that he was in charge, right? That he would certainly smile, and he was charming, and he was probably one of the nicest guys you could ever meet. But at the end of the day, he's your boss, not your friend. And that was something he always, kept a very clear eye on. And so I love that you grabbed that passage. That was one of my favorite facts to find, was just the geometry of this tent that he set up. And so I'm so glad you found that. And the last thing I'll say about it is Walter Bedell Smith, his right arm, throughout this period, sets up his own field tent right out of Southwick House on the estate, much closer to the action. And when Eisenhower goes there the day or two before the invasion to meet Charles de Gaulle, he's told to wait in Beadle's tent, which he hadn't seen until that time. And he goes in and is like 7 times as large as his own tent. And he's like, what is that doing? Right. But Beadle knew how to feather his nest for sure.
So, Michel, first of all, I want to mention I didn't ask you, Chris, what you're drinking there on the floor of the.
Well, because
nothing.
I was running down the stairs with a computer and a microphone and headphones, so the drink is upstairs.
All right, but I want to just mention that I have a Spotted Cow, which is a good Wisconsin beer, and I will, on George's behalf, I'll say that I'm drinking it out of a Marquette glass. Chris has just
Is that significant? Yeah.
In the hallway. Well, George went to Marquette. He's a big
Marquette
fan. So I think what you need is dancing girls in the background or in the foreground.
This will definitely be one for the record of history.
It'll keep you awake. And then, Michel, you're a human rights lawyer and a national security law scholar. And your last book about the Doolittle Raiders at least had a human rights trial in it. Why are you writing about Eisenhower? Why are you? I mean, it's a great topic. Why are you the guy? This is my litigator question, by the way.
Yeah, I'll take it. Yeah.
Go for it. Why are you the guy to write this book?
So the honest answer is, as you said, I wrote my last book, last Mission to Tokyo. It's about war crimes prosecutions in the Pacific after the war, and in the context of doing that, I ended up learning a lot more about World War II generally. And then also being much more aware of the books that are constantly being published about World War II in particular. And I noticed that, there's almost a book a minute about Winston Churchill. Patton gets a book probably every week. Even de Gaulle or Roosevelt, certainly Hitler, and then Stalin. All of these sort of major sort of epic figures that come out of the war get all of this romantic attention, but Eisenhower seemed to just be underappreciated. And I know that sounds like a strange thing to say for someone who does ultimately become, most importantly, the president of Columbia University, where I now work, but then also the president of the United States shortly thereafter.
There is that, yeah.
And it struck me as he's this person who simultaneously is, among the few who come out of the war and go on to bigger and better things, right? Like MacArthur certainly tries desperately to become president of the United States and never succeeds. And also is someone who was universally almost, certainly universally liked, but almost overlooked by his contemporaries almost as much as historians. And it struck me that was really weird because, here's the guy who actually beat the actual Hitler, right? He led the war in Europe. As I said, goes on to be one of the most consequential presidents in the 20th century. And yet no one seemed to be that interested in unpacking him the way someone like Churchill, again, gets sort of all the attention. And that just made me very curious. I was like, why? How is it that this massive list of accomplishments is sort of just taken for granted? Why is Eisenhower taken for granted? And I think part of it is because, I certainly have grown up in the era where leadership is almost equated with charisma, and whether or not it's, Churchill in the World War II context, but also, JFK and Barack Obama as Democratic presidents, Reagan and even Trump as Republican presidents, right? We tend to think of leadership as the person who's making the rousing speech, making the quotable quotes, and we don't necessarily think about the person who's actually getting things done, and particularly getting, the stuff that at the time looked impossible done. And D-Day, I think, was nothing if not seemingly impossible, in its earliest as they started to plan it. And so that's what made me curious. I got curious about how it was that Eisenhower was able to do that. And the more I looked into it, it got even more interesting because I realized that Eisenhower's ability to get big things done was very often tied to his very deliberate cultivation of the idea that he's nothing to worry about, that he's nothing to pay too much attention to, and that his own, genuine humility, I'm not saying it's phony, but his understanding that humility itself can, in that kind of environment, be a really powerful political weapon, political tool, if nothing else, made me really interested in him as someone who used political power more deftly and with greater effect than really almost any of his contemporaries. And that's what drew me to him. I really just got deeply curious in Eisenhower, the person, as someone who understood and used political power to enormous effect and to enormous consequence. And I wanted to understand that. And so honestly, the honest answer is genuine curiosity drew me to him and made me want to write this book.
Well, that's probably one of the greatest motivators. I think, one of the things I'd like you to comment on is people who know me and have traveled with me, and Rick knows that I'm biased, and I think that on the 8th day, God created Eisenhower because he's just so impressive.
Yeah.
But could you tell our viewers just how unlikely it is that he's going to be reaching this point? Like, what's his background and his progression, to become Supreme Commander? I mean, it's unbelievable.
It is. It almost makes his story even more interesting and is how this guy became that guy. And so, he's born. His father was, a complicated man, to say the least. He was abusive. He was prone to enthusiasms. He, very enthusiastically tried his hand at entrepreneurialism, failed at that, which meant that he ended up having to work as a railway engineer in Denison, Texas, which is where Eisenhower was born, before moving back to Abilene, Kansas, which is, near the dead center of the country, and is a town where the Eisenhower family had established itself a generation earlier after moving there from Pennsylvania. He grows up as the middle child of a very large family with a very sunny, happy, lovely, patient mother, given the fact that it was a family of 5 boys. And again, this very sort of emotionally remote, at times really quite abusive father. And to give you just a sense of that without belaboring it, his father was actually arrested in 1898 for beating a neighbor boy. And what struck me about that, and this is maybe where the lawyer in me comes out, a little more, is that's 1898. And that's in the middle of Kansas, right? Like, you had to have really done something to be arrested for hitting a child in 1898 in the middle of Kansas. He ultimately becomes fascinated with Eugene V. Debs. This is Eisenhower's father, David Eisenhower, becomes a socialist, runs for school board as a socialist, fails to win more than a couple dozen votes, and lives a life of, a really angry life that I think makes it very hard on Eisenhower growing up. His mother, I think, is emotionally probably his saving grace. It's certainly where Eisenhower gets his smile from. Yeah. His parents are also extremely religious. They are part of a movement that has since become the Jehovah's Witnesses, but at the time they were known as the Bible Students. And at the turn of the 20th century, the Bible Students were essentially a millennial sect. They had the firm belief that the world was going to end. Judgment Day, literal Judgment Day, was going to come in 2015. And Eisenhower's father had actually mapped out the prophecy of this, which is essentially a sort of a mystical reading of the design of the pyramids that the founder, Robert Taze Russell, came up with to use essentially the geometry of the pyramids to predict the future. Right. And so he comes from this very strange, sort of remote Kansas upbringing, and wants to be a soldier more or less since he can remember, and probably wants to go to West Point for about as long as well. And ultimately gets an appointment to West Point through sheer grit and, frankly, charm. He takes the local exam to test into West Point in Annapolis, gets the second highest score, gets his commission to go to West Point, almost as a way of rebelling against his parents, as strange as that sounds. And it's at West Point that he really begins to remake himself as the man, in a way, he always wanted to be and the man he would become. And it's through West Point, through a career in the Army, but in the sort of bureaucratic ranks of the Army, that he rises up as someone who is deeply liked, never fights in combat, not once. He doesn't fire a shot in anger, but he's someone who understands organizations. He understands people. He understands how to lead people. I think the biggest influence on him in that particular respect was that he coached football. He was actually quite the great football player. Plays in the famous Army Carlisle game against Jim Thorpe, but blows his knee out and is forced to essentially move to the coaching ranks in the years after. But that's probably the greatest thing that ever happened to the United States, because it enabled Eisenhower to learn how to lead men towards a common goal. And so it's really through, it's really through merit. It's really through being someone who's understood as able to work with others, as able to get things done, as able to see problems around corners and address them, that he ends up in George Marshall's inner circle, which in turn leads to his appointment to lead the earliest Allied operations in North Africa and Sicily and Italy in the first 2 years of the war. So he ultimately rises through the ranks by being competent, and by being liked. I think it's always important to emphasize that he had that political skill, that social skill that enabled people to really trust and get along with him.
There's another officer who's a character in your book named Fox Connor, and who becomes a general. But he is kind of an important mentor to Eisenhower, and also essentially saves Eisenhower's career at a point where he could have, been discharged from the army. So can you talk about both those things briefly?
Oh yeah, it's one of the great turning points in history. So Eisenhower at this time is stationed with the Tank Corps, the burgeoning Tank Corps at Fort Meade.
And when is this?
This is the early 1920s, 1920, 1921, 1922 is when he goes to Panama. And he befriends an up-and-coming young officer who had worked with tanks in Europe by the name of George S. Patton. And they become pretty quickly thick as thieves, really, best buddies in their time at Fort Meade. And one of the people Patton got to know as a mentor of his own is a guy named Fox Connor, who was one of the great American planners of World War I, really known as an intellectual of the Army, which is not always a great thing, actually, in the Army. But in Fox Connor's case, it earned him the undying respect of a lot of individuals he mentored over the years. And so Eisenhower is ending his time at Fort Meade, and in a really life-altering tragedy that I don't know that few people could ever really come back from, and I don't even know that Eisenhower came back from it. I wouldn't minimize it in that way. His son dies. He has a 3-year-old boy with Mamie, who right around Christmas between 1920 and 1921 dies of scarlet fever. Eisenhower is devastated. Mamie, of course, is completely devastated. He begins to, better or worse, become a workaholic, I think, in order to deal with that. But then within a few months, he gets implicated in an embezzlement scandal, of all things, that happens on Fort Meade, where he's essentially, wrongfully accused of submitting vouchers for housing for his son, who had subsequently died, that he wasn't 100% entitled to. It's almost a trivial amount of money. Even back then, it's about $300. But he's implicated in this embezzlement scheme, and he's exonerated by his commanding officer, who looks at the whole situation and says, "No, you didn't do this on purpose. You didn't do it wrong." But there's an inspector general in the War Department who just bites in like a rabid dog and tries to make an example out of Eisenhower, who at this point is a major in the Army. Eisenhower is looking at being court-martialed and potentially sent, not only expelled from the Army, but sent to jail time if this inspector general has his way. But through the indulgence of George Patton, Fox Connor orders Eisenhower to Panama to be his aide. And this is not a desired or desirable assignment. It saves Eisenhower's career and life, to be sure. But being sent to the depths of the Panamanian jungle to work on a brigade is one of the dullest and most physically unpleasant jobs you could almost have in the Army at that time. And he's miserable initially. Mamie's miserable. Mamie actually leaves after getting pregnant because she does not want to have a baby on this ramshackle fort on the Panama Canal that looks as if it's about to fall into the Panama Canal at any given moment. But in that isolation, in that heat, in that desperation, he comes to know the commanding officer of the fort, Fort Gaillard, who is not a cuddly figure at all, is actually deeply resented by many of Eisenhower's contemporaries. But that's Fox Connor. And Fox Connor is known at this time in a combination of resentment and awe for having the largest library in the Army. And one day, Connor asks him, "Do you like to read? Do you like history?" And Eisenhower responds, "Well, I used to like it, but then I went to West Point, and they beat the love of history, military history in particular, right out of you because it's all about memorizing maps and orders of battle." And so Eisenhower basically gets handed a few books by Fox Connor, some narrative histories of the Civil War. And then he comes back, and Fox Connor gives him a few more books. And slowly but surely, Connor cultivates in Eisenhower not only a rekindled love of military history, but a real understanding of what leadership is, a real understanding of why people made the decisions, for example, at Gettysburg. Connor not only gives him military history, but philosophy, including the Stoics. Friedrich Nietzsche turns out to have a surprisingly outsized impression on Eisenhower, particularly at that time in his life. And he leaves Panama 3 years later, again with the assistance of Fox Connor, to go join the Army's Command and General Staff School, which is the school that up-and-coming young senior officers and future generals have to go to in order to show their mettle in the basics of running a command and learning leadership and learning how to run military operations. Eisenhower is kind of cowed by the opportunity. His grades in West Point were not top notch, to say the least. He felt he was respectable. He was somewhere in the middle of the class, but he was more known for football and the number of demerits he got for behavior than it was his prowess in the classroom. But then over his time at the Command and General Staff School, he puts to use all the lessons that Fox Connor had taught him in Panama, where they would discuss these battles, they would discuss terrain, they would discuss the nature of leadership and military operations while riding horses through the Panamanian jungle. And Eisenhower comes out top in the class. And from then on, top out of a class of, I think it was about 250. And from then on, Eisenhower's career is a rocket. He gets recognized as being a unique talent in the Army that ends up giving him, all the opportunities that ultimately lead to his opportunities in World War II that we both know him for and are quite thankful for as well.
Right. Well, and again, bear with me with my unusual desk situation here, but one of the things that, again, it's so striking about him is his relationship with Marshall, and you have a great story in the book early on in their relationship. Marshall asked for some information, and Eisenhower comes down to the office to give him this information, and Marshall chews him out, right? He says, by God, I spend all this time trying to save you time, and you come in here. What is the telephone for? And Eisenhower responds, by God, it takes me longer to interpret what you're trying to say to me than to get in here. So, but you don't imagine a Patton flipping back at Marshall like that, or anybody, right? So, again, what is it about Eisenhower, and talk a little bit about that relationship, because it is kind of unusual.
Yeah. Eisenhower, in thinking about his career, and I think this is an important lesson in thinking about, our own place in our own careers and when, our opportunities, is he was someone who moved, he was someone who had a series of mentors, really starting with Fox Connor, but then moving through a number of other figures who are less well known, and who are in some ways quite controversial. It's General Moseley in the 1930s. Douglas MacArthur ends up being, one of his major mentors in the Philippines. And then ultimately George Marshall, I think, becomes probably one of, if not the most significant, certainly second most to Fox Connor in terms of significant mentors of his life. And he develops a, stern father, obedient son relationship with Marshall that few others could. Marshall was an extremely intimidating presence to all concerned. Yeah. The most famous encounter between Marshall and Roosevelt is when they first meet, and Roosevelt, in his sort of normal casual way, says, "Can I call you George?" And General Marshall says, "It's General Marshall, sir." Right? This is the president. And so that sort of like stoic formality. Marshall is a soldier's soldier. And Eisenhower knew how to not only be cultivated as a mentee, but also how to cultivate mentors, how to be loyal, how to understand their needs and to put their needs first, and becomes very quickly one of Marshall's most trusted aides. I think Eisenhower also benefited from, and I apologize if I've said this already, but the Eisenhower smile. He had an incredibly, almost preternatural ability to disarm people. With a bit of a smile, with a bit of charm, that didn't seem, either supercilious or just, non-serious, right? He got the things done that needed getting done, but was always willing to sort of have a lighter touch. George Marshall, at best, grinned at him in response, if you're to believe Eisenhower's recollection of these events. And so, yes, he very quickly learned Marshall's rhythms, like a good mentor-mentee relationship, a mentee and a mentor relationship should. And he did everything he could to make sure he met Marshall's needs, so that he was able to probably be more frank with George Marshall than a lot of other people could, because Marshall knew at the end of the day Eisenhower was trustworthy and was a man who could be trusted with Marshall's both interests and his life at times.
Yeah. So Marshall is Eisenhower's boss. He's the chief of staff of the U.S. Army. Now, we want to say that most of your book really focuses on the 28 weeks or so between the Cairo conference in late 1943 and the invasion that takes place on June 6, 1944. And we've barely touched on that time period. But let me ask you one question that does connect with Marshall and connect with that time period. Because I've always thought of Marshall as a guy who really had Eisenhower's back. He's, looking out for him in Washington. He's kind of looking out for him with the higher commanders. But at one point, he sends Ike a secret note proposing an airborne drop in Evreux, which is 100 miles inland. And I actually think it's on one of the maps that you sent. If I can pull it up here.
Yeah, it's on the third one. That one.
And if you can find it, it's pretty much halfway to Paris. So he's proposing dropping people in on Evreux, 100 miles inland. And I was really surprised by that, because I always thought of Marshall, A, as being kind of conservative, and B, as being someone who had his back, not somebody who's kind of making what seemed to me like almost crazy suggestions to him.
No. So this is a proposal that comes from the Army Air Forces at the time. But Marshall falls in love with it. And the basic proposal is to, either in lieu of or in addition to, but probably given the logistics involved, in lieu of the airborne elements that drop behind Utah Beach, to send the airborne troops deep into France in order to try and establish an airhead that the Air Forces can use. This is a chilling sort of preview of Market Garden, as many of your viewers and listeners might be more familiar with. And Marshall sends a very confidential memorandum saying, there is this operation that's been proposed. I love it. It's a great way of doing something innovative. Let's try something innovative. And in a sense, don't be such a wuss. Like, let's try and really break some new ground here. And it comes, I don't know if you remember where that comes in the book, but it comes right as Eisenhower is just being buffeted from all sides over the broader question of essentially how many landing craft are going to be available.
Right. The numbers game.
The war of the numbers. And he is just at the edge of his rope, right? He is losing his mind. And Marshall sends some folks over from the War Department, as I say in the book, sort of like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to more or less get Eisenhower back on the American side, because this is a really bitter dispute between the British and the Americans over the planning of Operation Overlord. And one of them is essentially carrying this letter saying, oh yeah, in addition to all these other things that are essentially fraying your nerves at every end, I also want you to do this entirely novel, totally insane airborne operation. Eisenhower reads it and immediately sees that this is a catastrophe waiting to happen. Why does Marshall, propose this, to your question? I think in part it's because, if you remember what's going on at this time, right, almost all of the major action, with the exception of the slow slog in Italy, all the major action in the war at this point is in the Pacific. And in the Pacific, they're doing all sorts of crazy new things that they had never tried before. And there's a, at the time, really quite famous general who Marshall admires quite a bit, by the name of George Kennedy, who is this essentially major innovator in Air Force tactics and operation in the Pacific. And one of the things he does in one of the early sort of island hopping operations that MacArthur and the Marines are doing is essentially vault a whole bunch of paratroopers well behind enemy lines to do, essentially an encirclement on one of these small islands. And so this is essentially a proof of concept to Marshall. And he gets very excited about the idea that we can do this in France as well. Essentially, that we can think of the battle space as three-dimensional. And in a sense, that's true enough. But Marshall is also transporting the sort of very, limited capabilities of the Japanese armies on a lot of these islands, as well as the much smaller geography of these sort of specks on a map, to France. And Eisenhower immediately sees, for all the reasons that, in some respects, that Market Garden becomes a disaster. He sees that this is going to be a complete catastrophe. You're going to put a bunch of paratroopers in the middle of France with no armor, with very limited provisions and weaponry, and you're going to have no way of relieving them or moving them around quickly if you need to. And he sees this as a terrible idea, sends a long memo back to Marshall, very gently explaining all of this to him. And Marshall still doesn't even let it go. Hap Arnold, who's the head of the Air Forces at the time, even persists in saying, I think Eisenhower is kind of being a wuss here, and sends and sort of lets that message get known to Eisenhower. But Eisenhower's like, no, this is going to be a catastrophe. I'm not going to do it. But it shows you sort of that there are all these relationships, including these mentor-mentee relationships that are quite close, right? Marshall made Eisenhower, and that there's no doubt about that, are, often fraught human relationships, right? Marshall, in some ways, certainly at this point, which is about February, March of 1944, Marshall had been planning, not just waiting, but planning to be the leader of Operation Overlord, to be the commander who would do this final great press into France on behalf of the Allies. And very much at the last moment, Roosevelt changes his mind and gives the job to Marshall's protege, right? Not just to someone else, but to Marshall's protege. And so, it's understandable in a way, in a human level, how this, Marshall could feel this kind of, in the way a parent does with a child, right, on a soccer field or something like that. There's an element of like, that was supposed to be me, and this is how I would do it, and why aren't you doing it this way? That you really do see play out in their day-to-day correspondence.
Hey, Chris, I want to congratulate you. I think you've really gotten control over the waving in the hallway there to keep the lights going out. For
everybody for their patience.
For everybody who's joined us late, Chris Anderson is in a hallway in a hotel in France. I'm in a study in Madison, Wisconsin, and Michel is there at his home. But Chris, go ahead. And Michel, I should also mention Michel Paradis is the author of a new book called The Light of Battle, about Dwight D. Eisenhower and the lead up to D-Day. Chris, back to you.
So, Michel, you have I would say, a fairly large section of the book that's entitled "Soldier of Empire," and I would like, as a expat who lives in Britain, I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on that and why you decided to name such a considerable portion of the book that.
So each section of the book is actually one of the titles given to Eisenhower over the course of his career and his life. And Soldier of the Empire is how literally King George, not King George III, but King George the Fifth or Sixth of during World War II. That is actually something he called Eisenhower, and it was because Eisenhower was. When Roosevelt made that choice to choose Eisenhower over Marshall, there are a lot of reasons, and Roosevelt gave a lot of different reasons to a lot of different people over time, and I think all of them are probably true to an extent. But one of the reasons that I think has been underappreciated is, that Roosevelt actually reveals in a conversation to his son, is that Eisenhower can get along with the British. And Marshall has let's just say, a mixed record of getting along with the British. And that's incredibly important in the lead up to D-Day for a number of reasons. One is the British are opposed to Operation Overlord almost from the moment it's proposed in 1942 and never really fully come around to it. And to the extent they do, it's only because really of Eisenhower, and particularly Eisenhower's, sort of the bear hug that Eisenhower gives to Bernard Montgomery that really makes it a British operation, right? And gets the British to fully invest in the cross-channel invasion of France. But it's also interpersonal. Eisenhower is, about 10 years younger than someone like Winston Churchill, whereas Marshall and Churchill are about the same age. Eisenhower is a bit of an Anglophile. He gets a lot of, to put it gently, flack from his American colleagues, particularly someone like George Patton, who is always accusing Eisenhower of siding with the British over the Americans. At one point, Eisenhower buys a pair and wears a pair of suede shoes, and George Patton just won't let it go. It seems like the most deepest betrayal of America that George Patton had ever seen to that point. But also Eisenhower was an Anglophile like a fox, if you'll borrow the, pardon the mutilated expression, because he would do things like when he would go review the British soldiers preparing for the D-Day landings, he'd wear a British officer's coat instead of his American officer's coat, because he very much did believe in multilateralism and very much believed in his role as an Allied commander, right? Not an American commander of Allied forces, but an Allied commander. But there's also an element of doing that's, like Alexander the Great going into Persia, right? When Alexander the Great goes into Persia after the conquest of Persia, he starts wearing Persian clothes, right? Because he wants this Greek invader of this massive empire that at that time in history had been literally the empire to contend with. He wants to seem more familiar, more acceptable to them. And that's a big part of, I think, how Eisenhower succeeds, not only in getting the British to give him what he needs to launch the D-Day invasion, but one of the sort of sub-themes of the book as a whole is a broader political history that this is also the moment, and really this 6 months is the moment when the Great British Empire, which at the start of the war covers a quarter of the earth, a quarter of the earth's people, is the center of all of all sort of economic communication and innovation activity. It's really in this over the course of the war, but I think even this 6 months where the United States goes from being this slightly reclusive, complicated collection of 48 states to being a superpower on June 6, 1944, where it's the United States is finally able to come into its own as a new kind of world power that is not an empire, that is not even a single country, but that is something different, and that promises something quite different to the world at large. And that's something different, getting to your question about the title of the chapter, that something different is really quite dangerous to the British Empire. Right. Really quite dangerous to European imperialism more generally. And yet the British don't resist, right? They don't fight us. They don't seek to counterbalance our rise. They don't even do what the French do, which is sort of like use every tiny little, stick of leverage they have to extort concessions out of us. They go along with, not only D-Day, but with the rise of a superpower that fundamentally undermines the stability of their global empire, in some ways replaces it. Yeah. And I think a big part of that is because of Eisenhower, right? Because Eisenhower was personally and publicly able to make the rise of America seem not only just appealing, right, in that sort of Eisenhower smile kind of way, but non-threatening. And I think that's just as important, that the British could feel like he was one of their own. He wasn't trying to undermine them, that he shared their values. And that was, I think, probably the canniest political thing he did, and probably the most consequential in thinking about the broader sweep of the 20th century.
So Eisenhower has 23 weeks, I think it is, from when he's named Supreme Allied Commander until the D-Day invasion. And you go into a lot of details about what fills those weeks. And one thing that keeps coming up time after time is landing craft and what you call, we actually already made a reference to it, the battle of the numbers. Now, I realize you could filibuster me out to the end of the show talking about this.
I'll try not to.
Can you give us a brief sense of what this is and why is it such a big deal that it keeps coming back to Eisenhower time after time?
Yeah. So long and short, Eisenhower is put in charge of Operation Overlord in the beginning of November 1943. And at that time, the planning for Operation Overlord was actually much different than the operation that ultimately gets launched on D-Day. The British, as I said, were never quite enthusiastic to Operation Overlord to begin with. And the original plan was for a fairly focused invasion on what people might know as the British beaches, right? Juno, Gold, and Sword, to take Caen. That was the original D-Day plan. And Eisenhower, both with his wealth of historical military experience, but also his wealth of experience from the past, year and a half of operations in North Africa, knows that this is guaranteed to fail. Right, it's too small. The Germans, excuse me, have about 500,000 Germans, with armor who can mobilize to Normandy within a matter of a week if they have to. So the idea of sending fewer than 100,000 men across the English Channel to try and take this one city is courting disaster. And so right away he understands that this is this plan needs to be enlarged significantly. And one of his, I think, most brilliant political masterstrokes is convincing Bernard Montgomery to go along with that, indeed to embrace it. And so they do. They expand the D-Day operation, almost double its size. But that means you're going to need a lot more resources than have been committed. And in a way, the only reason the British had gone along with Operation Overlord at the Cairo conference, which at the time also had a subsidiary operation invading southern France called Operation Anvil. Ultimately, this does happen in August of 1944 with Operation Dragoon. But at the time, one of the debates is, should we continue to focus in the Mediterranean, or should we do this new operation in France? And the British basically cut a compromise with the Americans where they say, okay, we're going to continue to do operations in France to include Italy, or excuse me, in the Mediterranean to include Italy, and we'll also authorize this invasion of France. So immediately there's a competition set up for resources between what can be done in the central and eastern Mediterranean, which is a British priority at the time, and in France with Operation Overlord, which is the American priority at the time. And by proposing to double the invasion immediately, Eisenhower is essentially picking the biggest fight he possibly could, right? It's the competition between the British and the Americans over where they should invest their resources in Europe. And for months on end, as you'll read in the book, this becomes probably one of the most acrimonious and petty seeming debates, right? It's almost like if you've ever seen people in a divorce, argue over the cutlery. You're like, this isn't about the cutlery, is it? Right? And the British and the Americans are just, at their throats, and Eisenhower is in the middle, trying to sort of reconcile them because he still needs the alliance to not fall apart if he's going to have any chance of, pulling off D-Day for sure, but even the broader war in Germany that's looking ahead. And so over the course of many months, and to add a mistress to the divorce, if you will, you also have the United States Navy, who wants nothing to do with Europe anymore, right? The United States Navy, from almost the beginning of the war, wants to mount the war in the Pacific. That's where they see the action being. That's where they want landing craft for the Marines, who are engaging in operations all the way up to the ultimately the Japanese archipelago, if they can. And so you have everyone wanting to pull the resources of the alliance in their own direction, and Eisenhower trying desperately, almost day by day, to keep everyone together long enough to make D-Day possible. So yes, the LST, the LCAs, there's a whole alphabet soup of landing craft that everyone planning the D-Day operation soon masters with minute tables. It's almost like when COVID was happening and every variant of COVID was on the lips of everyone in the United States, as if we were all epidemiologists. But it's sort of the great political battle between the British and the Americans in the lead up to D-Day that is, in a sense, a proxy war for preeminence.
So one of the criticisms or observations people make about Eisenhower is, he's not really the commander. He's the guy that smiles and shakes hands, and you talk about his thing, this Ike smile, but there's a lot more to him than that, and he certainly kind of doesn't like that label that's put on him. And you have a quote in the book that says, "It worries me to be thought of as timid when I've had to do things that were so risky as to be almost crazy." Oh, hum. He's writing to his brother. So clearly he doesn't see himself that way. But sure. Is there more to Eisenhower than what people's perception is?
Absolutely. That's what ultimately got me, as I said, early on, that's what made me so curious about Eisenhower, because he is this person who, smiles like he's selling Coca-Cola, and it's very easy for people to trivialize. And I think even people who admire him tend to trivialize how complicated and how smart and how ruthless at times he could be. But he was someone who understood that to use power effectively, particularly in an era of great instability, right, where empires are at stake, that to be seen as benign and non-threatening was probably the most important thing he could do. But it chapped his ass sometimes too, right? To be thought of as this guy who was just this, smiling, go along, get along kind of person because he had an ego just like everybody else does, right? He smoked a ton of cigarettes to deal with the stress. He tried to, he understood how difficult and complicated and risky the choices he was making are. And I think the quintessential example of that, which I spend a lot of time on in the book, is probably his most famous single decision, his most famous high risk decision, if nothing else, which is the decision to go. Right. Because there they are in Portsmouth. It's hot, it's sunny, right? As Chris knows, right? That's not typical of England, here, let alone in May. And his weather advisors come in and say, there's a storm brewing, right? The English Channel is going to boil with the storms that we see coming. And if you launch the invasion in this, you'll have no air support. The airborne operation, if you launch it, will be a catastrophe. The men are going to get seasick on the landing craft, if nothing else. And he has a meeting with his commanders. Montgomery wants to go regardless, but Eisenhower says, no, we have to trust the data, right? We have to trust the information that we've, come to cultivate over these many months. And at the time, that's a kind of decision that you don't make with your gut. You can't make it with your gut, right? When you're looking at a sunny sky, you can't call something off for weather, but he does. But then the next day, the storm does come through, and it's probably one of the worst storms England had seen at that time of year. And the weathermen come back and say there is a gap in the storm that's coming for all of these meteorological reasons that, I'm going to tell you, but you're really not going to understand. But you got to trust me that, on June 6th till about June 7th, June 8th, there's going to be a gap in the weather, and you can go then. And Eisenhower is faced with this conundrum of, do we go now based on this weather prediction, or do we wait? Because if we wait, right, we're going to have to wait near a month, and that's going to compromise security. It's going to potentially demoralize the men who've been sitting in these boats now, or ships. If there's a Navy person on the chat, the ships that all these men are on, and at the end of the day, everyone looks at it and says, okay, we'll support you, but it's Eisenhower who has to make the decision. And he doesn't make that final decision until, I think it's 4:30 in the morning. They're sitting in this reformed library that's in this old manor house, Southwick House. The rain is just raking against the windows. If you know an old English manor house, the wind is blowing through the manor house. And he sits there on this couch, on this leather couch, essentially entirely alone. Right, he looks around at all of these men who've given them his encouragement. But if this is a disaster, it's him, and that's the reason why it's a disaster. And he thinks about it and he says, "Okay, let's go," and that launches the entire invasion. And almost the first thing he does after that is write a resignation letter.
Hey, can I ask? Let me ask you a question. Let me throw in a question here, which you probably were going to answer without me throwing it in, but it just gives me a chance to talk. One of our viewers asked about that resignation letter. He says, "I've had a look at General Eisenhower's in case of failure message. How long did it take Ike to write such a remarkable missive? How many drafts did he compose?"
So the answer, I don't know the answer to how long it took him. But I do know how many drafts, and it's one. And that's because I was able to actually find the original handwritten copy where he did it. It's just a little piece of note paper, and he's writing with a felt tip pen. And to me, the most remarkable piece about this letter is not just what it says. And what it says is amazing, right? He's taking full responsibility for the failure. He says, everyone but me did.
If there's going to be a failure.
If there's going to be a failure, right. He's predicting failure. He's a bit punchy, right? He writes 5th of July, 1944, right? He's he doesn't even really fully know what month it is. But it's the parts of that note that he strikes out as he's writing it that are, to me, almost the most revealing of the stress he must have been under, because each time he writes something that he strikes out, you can see he's about to blame something, right? He's about to make an excuse for the failure, and he crosses that out. And that's, he moves on to simply say, everyone who did their job, they did what, duty and honor and I requested of them. And if there's any blame, it ultimately falls to me. And, it's this remarkable insight into not only, his personality, which I do think is, one of the most impressive just temperaments that we've had in a major leader in the United States, right? Someone whose gut instinct is to always ensure that all the blame falls onto himself and all the credit falls onto other people, which is why he's so effective at getting things done. But it's also this, abiding instinct that that he was the one who made the decision. It was the best decision he could make, and it turned out wrong, right? That's what he's anticipating. And he knows that that's going to probably be the end of his career. It might be a disaster for the war. Certainly, had the invasion failed, right, the rest of history would have turned out quite differently. America's place in history, I think, would be profoundly different. But he understood that all he could do was make the decision based on the best information he had. That was his responsibility, was to make a decision and to own it, fully. And in reading that note, you almost understand why the invasion succeeded, right? Because only the person who wrote that note could make something as complex and as difficult and as high risk as the D-Day invasion was. Only that person could make that invasion, that operation, succeed. And so, I highly commend it to anyone. It's worth reading. It's almost impossible to imagine a political leader today saying all of that, and to see it in the context of the D-Day invasion is just really a profoundly moving experience.
Chris, we're at 56 minutes in, but he just gave us a great answer. We could end on, but I know you might also, from the dark of your hotel, have one last question. I want to give you an opportunity.
Is Eisenhower the key figure of the war? You could even say of the 20th century based on that decision.
He would certainly say no.
Right. So
that
was an easy out.
I'll stick with his answer on that.
Okay.
But I think it's what drew me to the project. I think it's incredibly easy to underestimate his individual, like historians have all sorts of debates. I'm sure you're all familiar with them, right? About social forces, economic forces, et cetera, right? And they're always very critical of the, quote, great man of history. And you don't have to buy the great man theory of history to see Eisenhower as just in the perfect place at the perfect time, at that moment. And so I'm, as a biographer, you're going to overestimate it, but I will never underestimate his influence on history. If we have time, I have one question as well, just for Rick, because one thing we haven't talked about today is France, right? The French, I should say. And what of Eisenhower? I'd be curious to get your view of Eisenhower's relationship with de Gaulle, and how he worked that relationship, in particular in terms of ensuring that the United States was not greeted, with rifles by the French after bombing the French quite mercilessly for a number of months.
Well, I mean, I certainly don't fashion myself as an expert on Eisenhower and the French, but and Chris might have more to say about that. But I think that the answer is that Eisenhower was very, very careful with de Gaulle, and he treated him with a lot of respect, and yet he wouldn't, kind of give in to him. And I mean, I think that whole thing where de Gaulle says, I'll make a speech, and it's like, they're great. And then de Gaulle says, I won't make a speech. And Eisenhower basically says, screw him. If he won't make a speech, we'll go ahead. He'll come around. And he does come around. I mean, I think clearly, in some ways it feels like Eisenhower really lives up to his nickname of divine destiny, that he is a guy who seems to somehow almost magically make the right decision time after time. But Chris might say it's not magic. It has a lot to do with Eisenhower.
Yeah, I think he understands the situation. He understands the dynamic. And without de Gaulle, there's no restructured France at the end of the war, and there's no France as we know it. And he's the guy that kind of nurtures that relationship with that situation. I mean, there's no other Allied leader that's going to give de Gaulle as much room as Eisenhower does. Right?
Quite the opposite, right? Like Eisenhower is sort of absorbing punishment certainly from Roosevelt in his dealings with de Gaulle. But he sees that de Gaulle is the key, at least to...
It's necessary.
Yeah.
Right.
And we have gone long, but I am going to ask you one more question, Michel, that also came from a member of our audience, and I'll bring you up here, which is, what is the story with the ancient typewriter in back of you, and do you actually use it?
So yes. So taking those in reverse order again. Yes, I do still use it. It's a Royal typewriter. It is probably about 100 or so years old. It works as well as it did when it came off the assembly line so many years ago. I'm not going to pretend I wrote this book all on that typewriter. It's a long book, and that would take a lot of reading. And I recommend this to anyone who tries to write anything, whether or not it's a memo or an email or anything, and you're struggling to figure out how to write it. Change how you're writing it. So when I'm trying to figure out how to say something and I can't quite say what I mean, I reliably will go to the old typewriter here, try and just type it out. And for whatever reason, that tends to be the way I can uncrack my writer's block, essentially.
Wow.
Saying something. Sometimes it's also just my phone. Like sometimes I'll just tap something out on my phone too. So,
but the typewriter sounds better.
The typewriter definitely sounds better. And
Better story.
It looks cooler behind
it. Does, yeah,
right. You could put your phone back there, but it wouldn't have the same.
Not too much. Yeah.
Michel Paradis, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your new book, The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower. I only got through about half my questions, so we might have to bring you back at some point to answer some more. We hope you'll say yes to that. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, guys, and thanks everybody for your patience with the unique surroundings tonight, but really enjoyed it. Wonderful book. Thank you.
Real pleasure. Thank you so much. And
the book, by the way,
more whiskey to get through with you guys. So
all right,
and to the 90 people still left, the book doesn't even come out for another 9 days or 10 days. So you buy it now, and you can be one of the first people to have it, or go to the Barnes and Noble in New York City, where some copies have appeared magically.
In a brown bag.
All right, Michel, thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.
All right, next week we'll be back, and we'll bring back our conversation that we had with Stephen Puello, who is the author of, let's see if I can pull up the right book here, the great abolitionist.
Not the greatest abolitionist.
Not the greatest. Ooh, was there?
Lincoln might be the greatest.
Yeah, that could be an argument. Who's the greatest abolitionist? But this book is called The Great Abolitionist, Charles Sumner and the Fight for a More Perfect Union. It was a good interview. So we'll be bringing that one back next week. I will say this is the first of 5 encore episodes. This is our test to see if we still have an audience at the end of 5 encore episodes. But
wait till you see what's coming up when we go back live again.
I know when we go back live, we will be together. But that's
like on scene,
that's set. A long ways from now. It's in the distant future. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.